Good morning, Oklahoma. Welcome to the Middle Ground. I am your host, Michael Carnuccio. Well, our co-host this morning on the Middle Ground is Trent England with our sister program, MiddleGround Radio, which you can catch weekdays at 10 a.m. on 1640 a.m. The Eagle. Trent, thanks for being here again.
Yeah, thank you.
The radio show sounded great last week, and I know one of the topics was federal transparency. So let's start right there. I know there was a big conversation at the legislature. Update our viewers on what you all talked about.
Well, that's right. This is legislation making its way through the legislature, and took a big step this last week. Unanimously moved through a legislative committee on the House side, so it's headed for the House floor. This is House Bill 1748, and the big picture here is lots and lots of federal money flows into the state of Oklahoma, and that presents challenges for policymakers and potentially for just citizens who want to know how government works and who's really responsible for these different functions. The federal money comes in right now, and you could walk down and ask your state legislator what it pays for, what strings are attached. They don't know. This bill would fix that.
So a lot of times when federal money comes into the state, does it go into the legislature's purview, or is it going directly into a state agency, or how does it flow?
A lot of that money goes right around the legislature, right into agencies, right into local governments. And, people think of the legislature as being responsible for the state budget and state spending and setting priorities. Not knowing about where that federal money goes is a huge problem, just for legislative accountability and for budget writing, which we're going to see here in the coming months.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit, because some folks at home may be saying, well, I thought the federal government, they collect taxes. Of course, they're going to send money into the state. What's the real problem here? So is there a constitutional issue?
Well, there certainly is. And this is not, federal funds flow into the state, say to Fort Sill, right? That's totally different, because that's a federal installation. It's a federal responsibility. There are also federal dollars that flow into, well, the biggest one is Medicaid, but there's also, there is the funding that goes to public schools and school districts and other kinds of programs that the state runs. I mean, the state actually is responsible for those things, but some of the funding, and usually it's just a part of the funding, comes from the federal government. Maybe Congress has at some, years ago, picked a certain program and said, we like this and we want to give money to it. The legacy of all of these dollars and all the little strings attached means that legislators sometimes don't have the authority that they think they have to change policies. Sometimes they're required to spend additional state dollars, even when it's easy for people to feel like this money is free. It really isn't.
Yeah, let's talk about that additional state dollars, because that seemed to be the conversation that led to this measure, and a lot of what the House was talking about as the bill was in committee this week is that sometimes the federal government comes in with money, but it requires the state to spend matching dollars or pick up the tab after some time. So help folks at home understand what the legislature is looking at this year.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, some of the federal programs, especially recently, have been designed to they call it maintenance of effort, and they say if you, the state of Oklahoma, accept these funds, then you will have to agree to maybe match. Maybe you just put in 10% right now, but eventually you're responsible for this whole function of government going forward, even if the federal money goes away, which there's a constitutional problem with that, because it really undermines the authority that we think that the legislature should have. But obviously there's also just a practical problem that if the legislature doesn't include that appropriately in their budget forecasts, they don't really, how are they to write a state budget responsibly?
And so for folks at home to understand, you mentioned education, and that's an area where a lot of dollars come in. What we're hearing is that federal dollars will come in, but there's strings attached that require certain things to happen in school, maybe even for curriculum. And so you start having teachers that are saying, well, I can't do this, or I can't run my classroom, and this all ties together?
Well, and you could just throw out a couple buzzwords: No Child Left Behind and Common Core, right? And No Child Left Behind does tie federal dollars to certain policy decisions made in schools. And the concern about Common Core, there was a federal program called Race to the Top that was tied to Common Core, but the concern was, there was nothing stopping the federal government from just eventually saying, if you don't implement Common Core, we won't fund special education in your schools. And again, right now, the federal bureaucracy They may know where the money goes. We want state policymakers to know just as much as the federal government does.
So as part of this conversation, how dependent states, and specifically the state of Oklahoma, is on the federal government to fund its operation?
Well, that's right. I mean, Oklahoma is, the epithet is thrown around. It's a welfare state. More federal money flows into Oklahoma than Oklahomans pay in federal taxes. But that doesn't tell the whole story. A lot of those policies aren't actually supported by Oklahomans, and a lot of that money isn't really free. And so, no, that's right. It's about power and control and transparency, and that's why, I mean, this debate, it may sound to viewers like, well, this is kind of the inner workings of government, but House Bill 1748 really is about having a much better conversation about state and federal power.
You said it passed unanimously through committee. It'll probably run into some opposition. Quickly, in about 15, 20 seconds, why would someone be opposed to this measure?
State agencies don't like it. They don't like people looking over their shoulder. They feel like they have relationships with these federal bureaucracies, and injecting the legislature in there causes them some concern.
Trent, you're going to stick around. We're going to have a little more conversation about this session coming up. Well, this legislative session, it does appear that education and taxes are the biggest issues. Well, a new poll asked voters what they thought about those particular issues, and the results may surprise you. Stay tuned.